Welcome to Heartline Stories. Today's story follows Mark, a successful millionaire who unexpectedly meets his ex-wife at a bus stop with a baby. But when he looks closer, he's shocked to learn that the child in her arms might be his. How will this meeting change everything? What happens when past and present collide? Stick around to find out what comes next. Let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It was a sunny morning in New York City, and Mark Richardson was rushing to a meeting. He was the CEO of a successful tech company, living in a luxurious penthouse. Life had been busy for him lately. As he waited for the light to change, Mark noticed a woman sitting at the bus stop across the street. She looked familiar. Could it really be her? Mark thought to himself. The woman had short brown hair and wore a simple but elegant dress. He had not seen her in years. She was his ex-wife, Megan. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not here, at a bus stop in the middle of the city. His mind started to race. The last time they spoke, they had parted on bad terms. They had tried to make their marriage work, but their busy lives and differences had led them to separate. That was 5 years ago. He was about to turn away and keep walking when something caught his attention. Megan was holding a small baby in her arms. The child looked to be around a year old, with curly brown hair and big bright eyes. Mark paused for a moment, staring at the baby. There was something strangely familiar about the child. But what was it? Mark's curiosity got the best of him. He took a deep breath and walked over to the bus stop. "Megan?" Mark asked softly, trying not to startle her. She looked up, and for a second, there was silence. Then her face softened, and she gave him a small smile. "Mark, it's been a long time." Mark couldn't help but smile back. "Yeah, it has. I didn't expect to see you here today." Megan nodded. "I know, I was just waiting for the bus. Life's been different." She shifted the baby in her arms, clearly a little uncomfortable. Mark's gaze shifted to the baby again. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the child. "She's beautiful," he said, trying to make conversation. "His name is Lucas," Megan replied, glancing down at the baby. "He's growing so fast, I can hardly believe it." "Lucas?" The name echoed in Mark's mind. "Megan, how old is Lucas?" Mark asked, his heart racing. "He's almost 2, Megan said, looking up at Mark with a soft smile. Mark's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, almost 2? That means, Megan, how—" His voice trailed off. Megan's expression shifted, and she looked at the baby in her arms with a deep breath. "Mark, there's something I've been meaning to tell you for a long time," she said, her voice a little shaky. Mark's mind raced. What was she going to say? Megan took a moment before speaking. "Lucas is your son?" Mark froze. "What? What do you mean, my son?" Megan nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never told you, Mark. I didn't know how, but when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know if you would want to be a part of our lives." Mark's world seemed to stop for a moment. His heart raced and he felt as though he couldn't breathe. His mind was spinning. "You mean Lucas is mine?" Mark whispered, still unable to comprehend what Megan had just told him. Megan nodded again. "Yes, Mark. He's your son. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to cause more pain. I thought it was better to keep it to myself. I didn't know if you would want anything to do with him." Mark stood there, feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. He looked down at Lucas, who had begun to smile, his big brown eyes staring up at him. For the first time in years, Mark felt a connection to someone, something that he couldn't quite explain. He dropped to one knee, looking at the baby with wonder. "I didn't know. I never knew," Mark said softly. "But now I know, and I'm not going anywhere." Megan looked at him with surprise, her eyes filled with hope. "You mean it?" Mark smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I mean it, Megan. I'm not going anywhere." As he stood up, holding Lucas for the first time, Mark realized that his life was about to change in a way he never expected. The bond between father and son was something he couldn't deny. He felt a deep sense of love for the little boy, even though they had just met. "Do you want to get to know him?" Megan asked, looking at him with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Mark nodded. "Yes, I do. I want to be a part of both of your lives." And with that, Mark's life was forever changed. But he didn't know just how much this decision would affect him, Megan and Lucas, in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Mark spent the next few days trying to process everything that had happened. It was hard to believe that he was a father now. He had built a successful life for himself, surrounded by wealth and luxury. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a project to fix. This was real life. And suddenly his world felt a lot more complicated. He met with Megan several times over the next week. They sat in coffee shops, at parks, and sometimes at her apartment, talking about the past, the present, and their future. Lucas seemed to take to Mark right away. The little boy would giggle whenever Mark smiled at him, and he would grab his finger, not wanting to let go. It made Mark's heart swell, but there were still many things left unsaid between him and Megan. Mark knew that she had made the decision to raise Lucas on her own, without him, but he didn't understand why she hadn't reached out to him sooner. Why had she kept the truth from him for so long? One evening, as they were sitting at a small cafe, Mark finally asked her, "Megan, I've been thinking, why didn't you tell me about Lucas earlier? Why did you keep him from me?" Megan looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. "I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. We were already going through so much, Mark, and I knew how busy your life was. I didn't think you'd want to take on this responsibility. I was trying to protect both of you." Mark listened carefully, his mind racing. "But that was my choice to make, Megan. I should have known. We could have figured it out together. And now I'm trying to make up for lost time." Megan nodded, looking down at her cup. "I know. I regret not telling you sooner, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to get your hopes up and have you reject us. But now that you're here, I'm just so grateful. I can see how much you love Lucas already." Mark smiled at that. It was true. He had never felt a love like this before. There was something about Lucas, something that felt like he had always been a part of him, even if they hadn't met before. But Mark still had his doubts. Was he ready to be a father? Could he balance his busy life with the responsibility of raising a child? He had everything he ever wanted in terms of career and wealth. But was he ready for this new chapter? Megan noticed his hesitation and reached out to touch his hand gently. "Mark, I know this is a lot to process, but I believe you can do this. You have the heart, and that's the most important thing." Mark squeezed her hand, feeling comforted by her words. "I want to try, Megan. I really do." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of changes for Mark. He began spending more time with Lucas, taking him to the park and even taking him to work for short visits. He found joy in the little moments, when Lucas smiled up at him, when he said his first words, and even when he threw a tantrum. It was all part of the process. Megan was supportive, but Mark could tell that there were still some unresolved feelings between them. It wasn't easy for her to trust him again, especially after so many years of being on her own. She had built a life without him, and now they were trying to figure out how to blend their worlds. One afternoon, as Mark was playing with Lucas in the park, he noticed a couple walking by. They were laughing together, holding hands, and there was a look in their eyes that Mark recognized. It was the kind of look that he used to share with Megan, the kind of look that said they had been through a lot but were willing to try again. Mark took a deep breath, realizing that maybe, just maybe, that was what he and Megan could have. A fresh start, a chance to be a family. But it would take time. They both had a lot of healing to do, and Mark was willing to put in the effort. He looked down at Lucas, who was giggling as he ran around in circles. "You know, little guy," Mark whispered, "I think we're going to be okay." And as the sun set behind the trees, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Mark spent the next few days thinking about what he had said. It felt good to think that things could work out between him, Megan, and Lucas, but he knew they had a long way to go. Megan was still cautious around him, and he understood why. He couldn't expect everything to change overnight. He started adjusting his schedule to spend more time with them. Instead of attending business meetings and traveling, he spent weekends at the park, playing with Lucas, and helping Megan with errands. It wasn't easy to switch from his fast-paced lifestyle to this new rhythm, but he was determined to make it work. One evening after a long day of work, Mark walked into his office, sat at his desk, and stared at the framed photo of him and Megan from their wedding day. It felt like a lifetime ago. He picked up the photo, running his fingers over it. Had he made the right choice by coming back into her life? Would he be a good father to Lucas? Suddenly, his phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Megan. "Hey," she said softly. "I've been thinking. I know things are moving fast, and I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for. I just want to make sure you're okay with all of this." Mark smiled to himself, realizing how much he appreciated her honesty. "I'm not rushing into anything, Megan. I'm just trying to be present for both you and Lucas. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm not going anywhere." She paused for a moment, and he could almost hear the relief in her voice. "I know. I'm just scared, you know? I've had to do it all alone for so long, and now everything is changing." Mark understood. He had a lot to prove, but he was ready. He could feel the connection with Lucas growing stronger every day. It felt natural, like a bond that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Later that week, Mark invited Megan and Lucas to a fancy dinner at his favorite restaurant. It wasn't much, a simple gesture, but it meant a lot to him. As they sat at the table, laughing and sharing stories, Mark realized that no amount of money or success could compare to the feeling of being with them. As the night went on, Mark reached for Megan's hand across the table. "I know we've been through a lot, but I think this is the start of something good. For us, for Lucas, for our family." Megan looked at him, her eyes softening. "I hope so, Mark. I really do." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Mark was ready to face whatever came next. After all, family was more important than anything else, and he was willing to fight for theirs. As they walked out of the restaurant together, Lucas asleep in Megan's arms, Mark couldn't help but feel grateful. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Mark and Megan walked down the street under the glow of the streetlights, Lucas nestled in Megan's arms. Mark couldn't help but notice how peaceful they looked, like a family. For the first time, he could picture a future with them, a real, lasting one. But the doubts lingered. He still wasn't sure how to balance his busy work life with the new responsibilities he was taking on as a father figure. "I've been thinking," Megan said quietly as they walked, breaking the silence. "What if things don't work out? What if it's too much for us?" Mark stopped walking for a moment, taking a deep breath. He hadn't expected her to voice those fears so soon, but he understood. It wasn't just about him coming back into her life. It was about everything that came with it. The uncertainty, the changes, the risk of getting hurt again. "We'll take it one day at a time," Mark said, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "I won't rush you. I promise," Megan smiled, but there was still a glimmer of worry in her eyes. "I just want to make sure Lucas has the best. He deserves the best, Mark. I won't settle for anything less for him." "I get that," he replied, "and I'm not here to disrupt his life, Megan. I want to be a part of it, but I want to do it right." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I just need to know you're in this for the long run, Mark. That's all." Mark thought about that for a moment. He wasn't sure what the future would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He was willing to try. For Megan, for Lucas, and for the chance to build a family again. Later that night, after dropping Megan and Lucas off at her apartment, Mark sat alone in his car for a while, staring at the city skyline. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of: wealth, success, freedom. But he realized it meant little without the people he loved. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, reminding him of a big meeting in the morning. Mark sighed and shook his head. He'd spent so many years chasing money and status. Now all he wanted was to be present in their lives, to build something meaningful. But how could he truly balance both? As the next few days passed, Mark began adjusting to his new routine. He still had his responsibilities as CEO, but he also made it a point to spend more time with Megan and Lucas. They visited parks, went to the zoo, and even attended Lucas's Little League games. Mark learned quickly that family life wasn't as smooth as he'd imagined, but it was something he wanted to keep fighting for. One weekend, Mark invited Megan to his office. He had a surprise planned for her. He could see the skepticism in her eyes, but he smiled, determined to show her that he meant what he said. "What's this all about?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. Mark led her into his office, where a huge bouquet of flowers sat on the desk. There was a note attached that read, "For Megan and Lucas, our new beginning." Megan's eyes softened as she looked at the flowers. "Mark, this is unexpected. I've been thinking about it," he said, taking a step closer. "And I want to show you that I'm serious about this. About us." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate this, Mark, but I need more than flowers and promises. I need consistency, trust, and I'll prove that to you," he interrupted. "I'll show you I can be the man you and Lucas deserve. Not just with words, but with actions." Megan paused, considering his words. "Okay," she said finally, "but remember, actions speak louder than words." Mark nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He didn't expect everything to be perfect, but he was willing to put in the effort. For Megan, for Lucas, for the family he never knew he needed. Mark continued to put in the effort, proving with each passing day that he was serious about being a part of Megan and Lucas's lives. He adjusted his schedule, making time for dinners, park visits, and even picking Lucas up from school. Slowly but surely, Megan started to see the change in him. She saw the man who had once been all about business and success, now focusing on building something more meaningful, a family. A few months later, Megan and Mark sat together at the kitchen table, Lucas playing with his toys nearby. Mark looked at her, a smile on his face. "I think we've come a long way, don't you?" Mark said, his voice full of hope. Megan smiled back, her eyes softening. "I never thought I'd say this, but yes, we have. You've been more present than I ever expected. And Lucas, he loves having you around." Mark's heart swelled with warmth at the thought. He reached over, taking her hand gently. "I want to keep being here for both of you, for as long as you'll have me." Megan's smile widened, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that this could really work. They had their challenges, but they were stronger together. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm golden glow over the room, Megan leaned in and kissed Mark on the cheek. "I think this is just the beginning, Mark." Mark felt a rush of happiness flood through him. He had started this journey unsure of what to expect, but now, with Megan and Lucas by his side, he knew one thing for sure. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And with that, their story continued. A beautiful new chapter, full of love, hope, and the promise of a future built on trust and togetherness. Thank you for joining us on this Heartline story. Life has unexpected twists. Sometimes the past can come back to change everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.